There's different possible explanations, but the explanation that Shaykh Imran is given is, I would say it makes sense, but if it is true, very ominous indeed, because it means there's social engineering taking place at such a scale that's unprecedented. You know, how people are controlling our masses through media, through Al Jazeera channels and these other channels, how they're controlling our masses. Okay, I'll just keep glancing at the time because I realize I need to. This is the background. This is the background now. So Shaykh Imran is saying, Yajuj and Majuj are released at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Some others like Imam Anwar Shah Kashmiri has also said this. Yeah, based on the Sahih Hadith. He's also saying that the Jews don't return to Jerusalem until the Gog and Magog are released. Why do Western Europe become so obsessed with Jerusalem during the Crusades? And then during this last century, when did the Jews actually return? When the Britain and its allies won the First World War. And what did they do? They defeated the Ottomans. So the Khilafah al-Islamiyah, the Islamic Caliphate, came to an end after 1,423 or 24 years. A very huge event, you know. Britain and its allies put an end to the Islamic Khilafah. When they put an end to the Islam, what did they do? They took Jerusalem. And then suddenly, so that is a signal for the world order, the Gog and Magog world order being established. When the Khilafah finishes, at the end of the First World War, Britain and its allies divide up the Ottoman lands. They take Jerusalem. The Gog and Magog world order is established. The Jews are then sent back to Jerusalem. So, some parts of Shaykh Imran's thing I didn't find convincing. Like, he says the Gog and Magog were the Khazar people. The Khazar people, near the Caucasus region. These people were a tribe of Turkic origins that converted to Judaism. They converted to Judaism. Yeah. Soon after the time of the Prophet ﷺ. When they were faced with the Muslims on one side and the Christians on the other side, they converted to Judaism. And then later on they sort of disappeared from history. So people saying, you know, they sort of infiltrated into Western Europe and they were the Yajuj wa Majuj people. So this I didn't find convincing, because if you look at the description of Yajuj wa Majuj, they're behind a barrier. They're trapped behind a barrier. The Khazar people were from the Caucasus region. There's, you know, so Shaykh Imran Hussain was saying there was probably a barrier between these certain mountains. Yeah? But what about the other directions? What about the three other directions? There was nothing to stop them from moving out. So I never really found that convincing. Unfortunately, I'm not going to have time to go for everything, but inshallah, we'll do what we can in the time that remains. No, sorry, you don't need to. I can see the time. What happened next? I was reading a book by Christopher Walker, Islam and the West. Yeah? Highly recommended book. He talks about the entire history of the relationship between Islam and the West, and from the time of Sayyidina Umar until today. And he's a very fair dealing of the subject, you know, not at all anti-Islam or anything like that. I'll read you the passage that I came across that triggered off my investigations about the Vikings. So he says in his book Islam and the West, he's talking about the Crusades. And he was saying, why did the Crusades suddenly come about? You know, because it was a massive thing in Western Europe. It was a massive phenomenon. Not in the rest of the world. The Islamic world barely noticed the Crusades. We nowadays have become more obsessed than our ancestors were. In the Islamic world, the Crusades were barely noticed, trust me. They took it to very small areas around the coast, and they were soon taken back. We now are putting more prominence to the Crusades because we are now dominated by Western Europe, so it's sort of rewriting our own history. At the time, the Crusades for us were not a big deal. In Western Europe, they were massive. They literally gripped the whole of Western Europe for 3 centuries, this idea of going and getting Jerusalem from the infidels. So Christopher Walker, he's saying, you know, how did the Crusades come about? He says, within Europe, a number of elements changed the prevalent attitude from peaceful pilgrimage to violent conquest of the Holy Land. Because before that time, Europeans had been coming peacefully and doing pilgrimage in Jerusalem. There was no problem. Muslims were more than happy to have Jewish people, Christians, anyone, coming to do their pilgrimage, staying in the city. With very, very, very minor exceptions, the Muslims were very accommodating. So he's asking the question, why suddenly then Western Europe becomes so hostile towards Jerusalem, towards the Muslims? There's no really reason for it. So he says there's 3 elements. The first was the coming of the Normans. This people, originally from Scandinavia, had within 2 generations remodeled itself as a dominant force within the society of Europe. They were assertive, dictatorial, controlling and militant, though sometimes content to act as mercenaries. These people, the Vikings and their descendants, the Normans, they're pragmatists. They liked social hierarchies. They weren't people of, you know, equality, everyone's equal. They liked social hierarchies. We're better, those people are low caste, we're high caste, that type of approach. If they could not be dominant, they were content with submission with a tendency towards warfare. They were pragmatists. They were happy if there's somewhere we can't take by force, we'll work with that. They seem not to have rated equality highly, but they were greater agents for change, perhaps as a result of their instincts for violence and hierarchy. They made their militant cause popular by gaining, where necessary, the blessing of the Pope, but were unafraid of excommunication. In other words, they used Christianity for military and power interests. They were happy to become Christian if it was help them to get into positions of power, but they were also happy to disobey the Pope if the need arose. They were hypocrites, in other words. That's one of their deep-seated attributes of these people, is they're people of not of faith. They're people of deep kufr. They used the papacy as they saw fit, and the papacy made use of them. When William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066, his army was led by a knight carrying a papal banner emblazoned with a red cross. The invasion of England thus took on the appearance of a crusade before the Crusades. In dating the capture of Jerusalem, in brackets, the event preferable to all events. The event preferable to all events, the capture of Jerusalem. Why are they obsessed with Jerusalem? You see? Fulcher of Charters made a point of indicating that it occurred 12 years after the death of William, King of England. So there's a link here between the Normans, between England, and between the Crusades. So when I read this passage, this particular passage, it triggered these thoughts in my head, which hopefully triggering in your head, as I've told you the background to where I was coming from, right? So I was thinking, interesting, you know? Because why were Western Europe becoming so obsessed with the Holy Land? Okay, so who are these guys, the Normans, that suddenly have come up, right? They've come to prominence, to power in major centers of Europe, especially Britain. Remember, going back to also Dajjal and Britain, yeah? So they've come to power. These people then suddenly are instigating this violence towards Jerusalem. So I think probably for a few weeks that was just rolling around in my head. And then I decided, let me check out who are these guys, the Normans, you know. Could they possibly be Yajuj wa Majuj? I thought to myself. So, you know, I just done the normal thing, Google search, yeah? Ask Shaykh Google. And it says, you know, they were descended from the Vikings. Like he said as well, they came from Scandinavia. These people were descended from the Vikings, the Normans. Yeah? And they came from the furthest north, you know, from Norway. So now I was thinking, okay, you know, about Dhul Qarnayn going to the west, then to the east, north. I looked in the Tafsir, Imam Fakhruddin Ar-Razi, he said he went north. He went north. Even though the Quran doesn't say that, the Mufassirun, they believe that he went north next, you know, the third direction. So these guys, the Vikings, I started then reading about the Vikings. They came from the furthest north, northwestern point, right? And what were historians saying about them? They said it was unexplained how they exploded upon Western Europe. They suddenly emerged from their homeland in a massive pouring out of people, and they start invading and plundering neighboring countries like Britain, Ireland, Scotland, and those areas of Europe as well that were next to that, you know, to the coast. France, parts of Germany. But so what historians were saying was, it's really unexplainable. Historians have been unable to explain why the Vikings suddenly gushed forth from their home place in such huge numbers. So when did this happen? I thought to myself. The first attacks took place on the northeastern coast of Britain about 150 years after the Prophet ﷺ. Yeah? So this is when they suddenly start pouring out. Yeah? 150 years after the Prophet ﷺ said, Yajuj and Majuj there's been a breach in their wall. Suddenly these people from the furthest north. Yeah? And the other thing was that Norway is so far north that it's very cold, obviously. But other places that are the same northern latitude are much colder, and you can't really live there, like Alaska, Greenland, Siberia. They're much colder on the same north. So it's actually the most northern place that you can actually live. And why? Because there's a certain current in the ocean called the Gulf Stream, which actually moderates the climate there, keeps it more habitable for human beings. So in a way, it literally is the most northern place that people could live, you know, apart from Eskimos or, you know, people who live in igloos or something. So I was thinking, subhanAllah, that's strange, you know, the timing is right, the place. Let me look on the map. Is there any mountains up there? You know? So you look at the map, look at Google Earth or look at a map of the Earth, yeah? What do you see running along the whole of Norway? A massive chain of mountains. A massive range of mountains all the way across the country. So if you were trapped behind those mountains, you couldn't go in any direction because you have the sea, you have the North Pole literally behind you. You understand? The other thing then I also found was those mountains are particularly difficult to get over. Why? More difficult than normal mountains. Why? Because remember we said the moderating effect of the Gulf Stream is there. That moderates the climate. But as soon as you start climbing those mountains, you lose that effect of that ocean, of the ocean nearby, and it becomes very freezing, like Siberian, Alaskan levels. So you can't go over those mountains. You can only go through. Obviously, if there's a way through, you can go through. So if that way through were to be blocked, it would be a formidable barrier to people that were trapped on the other side of the mountains. Other things I found, the Viking chiefs themselves, historical reports that we have, they were saying, one of them reported that he was from the furthest north of all the Northmen. Because they became called Northmen, people from the north. These Vikings from the north. He said, I was from the furthest north. So in other words, from beyond the mountains. You understand? So this is the process I was going through. Okay? I was thinking, subhanallah, this is ajib. Okay? Then I came to the end of what I could do through Google. So I went to a university in London, where I'm studying at the moment, and I went to their library, and I went to the Scandinavian section, and I spent quite a long time, many days, in that area, reading through a lot of stuff to try to figure out more about these people, the Vikings, where they came from, what do we know about their history, what do we know about their ancient history. Not much is known about them. Yeah? When they burst upon European stage, about 150 years after the Prophet ﷺ, there was no history known about them. Yeah? The people at the time, like in Britain, the Christians who were in Britain, France, Germany, they were Christian countries. They described them as barbarians, infidels, pagans that have come. Pagans mean idol worshippers. And some of them even said these are Gog and Magog that have been prophesied in their Christian books. So these are the people from the north, the pagans from the north, that were prophesied to come at the end of time. Yeah. So these people were coming down. They only started writing their history about 100, 200 years after that time. So we don't have written historical records about them. The early time. We know about later on when and that time, that 300 years after they first attacked Britain, became known as the Viking Age. The Viking Age. That just indicates to us how powerful and how prominent they were in Western Europe and Northern Europe at that time, during those 300 years. Yeah? So it becomes known as the Viking Age. So they were coming out in thousands. Please obviously read the article when you have time. It's on the website, West London School of Islamic Studies website. I can't go through everything that's in the article today. I'm just giving you some things from there that we have time to do. We will definitely stop for Shaykh Imran by 4 inshallah. So read the article, and I haven't put everything in the article either that I found. So this is the Viking Age. Now hundreds, thousands of these people are pouring out from the most northern part of Europe, Scandinavia, what's now called Norway and Sweden, and Denmark as well. Yeah? They're pouring out in their ships. They're attacking, plundering, looting. You know about the Vikings, yeah? They're notorious. They settle in certain places as well. Over those 300 years is a long time. It's a long time. Think about it. I won't read. There's descriptions from Europeans of the time about the Vikings and what was going on, so you can read them yourself. How they were going into Paris, into the rest of France, into Germany, and especially the island of Britain and the surrounding islands of Britain. So Ireland, that was the main place they were always attacking. Sometimes they would settle, sometimes they would go back with their plunder. So this process takes over 300 years. It's the Viking Age. Like I said, historians till today can't explain how did these sudden thousands and millions come out from this place all of a sudden at that particular juncture in history. Some theories have been proposed, but none have been found historical evidence for that. Some historians said it was because they invented those ships that they were able to then, you understand? But there's no evidence that they invented those ships. Why would they invent them at that particular time? Also, some said it was population explosion. Yeah. Once again, no evidence for that though. There was something else, and then I found a very interesting one particular book in that library, which actually paints a picture of what happened in that area around about the same time as the Prophet ﷺ. Because remember, now we're talking prehistory. There's no written records. This is stuff they're piecing together through archaeological evidence. What was happening in the 7th century when the Prophet ﷺ lived in the 7th century? You know, if we're saying Gog and Magog were released at that time, what was happening in Norway and Sweden at that time? We don't know really, but there's, you know, they've tried to put together a story. So this one person, a historian called Jesh, right? I'll read you what she's wrote. First of all, she says, the Scandinavian peninsula in early medieval times. Early medieval is time of the Prophet. The medieval period starts just after the time of the Prophet. In early medieval times, as well as today, was ethnically and culturally a dual region, with a Sami minority speaking a language of the Uralian group and a majority Germanic group. So the Sami were the northern group, while the Germanic ethnic group inhabited the southern regions of modern-day Sweden. So first of all, she's saying in Norway and Sweden there's two different peoples. Two different peoples, ethnically and culturally different. You understand? So this goes back to the Quran, which mentions that Dhul Qarnayn, when he came across those people, there was two of them. There was one people that said to Dhul Qarnayn, protect us against Ya'juj wa Ma'juj. So that also added to the picture, you know, that these are historians that are saying there's always been two different, ethnically and culturally different people, speaking different languages as well. Now the other thing that happened, the same author, she says, something very significant happened to the people of that area of Scandinavia during the period of the late 6th to 7th century. Remember we said the Prophet ﷺ lived in the early 7th century. Early 7th century. So this is around the time of the Prophet ﷺ. She says something very significant happened to the society, to the culture. What happened? She actually put a subtitle in the chapter, The Change. The change. The whole society changed all of a sudden. Yeah? So she says, before this change, the Scandinavian farming societies, they lived and farmed peacefully, with a certain type of economic system based on redistribution of. They had a farming agricultural society and a certain type of economy, and they were peaceful. They had no expansion or thoughts of expansion or invasion. Suddenly, around about this time of the Prophet ﷺ, this change takes place. Yeah? The extensive farming system was abandoned, and the cultural landscape slowly changed. The whole culture changes. This is based on archaeological evidence of the type of houses they had, the type of animals they were keeping, the type of burials that were taking place, and all of that. When the previous farming economy collapsed, a large number of families left their homes. What happened to them and their animals? All we know is that in many regions the farms were never rebuilt, and people never returned to their homeland and ancestral graves. These people just disappeared, and a different type of people have taken over. So this is the same time Prophet ﷺ is saying Ya'juj and Ma'juj have been released. These people in Scandinavia, in Sweden, have been erased, and a new people have taken over there. What characterizes the new people? This same historian Jesh, she says, a different landscape emerged on the Scandinavian peninsula. By 700, so by 700 after the Prophet ﷺ, the houses of the settlements were smaller. They had room for fewer animals. Only special people were buried now. Previously everyone would be buried. So now it becomes a hierarchical caste system, you see. An intensified agriculture had taken the place of the former extensive system, etc., etc. New families come into power. Emergence of memorial forms and a stratum of landholders who strive to acquire as much land as possible is characteristic. So now you have these new people there that are more interested in acquiring more and more land. Okay. Should we do this for the next 5-10 minutes before Shaykh Imran comes? Should we just have any questions? Because even, I'm afraid, 1.5 hours wasn't really enough to cover the thing in depth. But hopefully, inshallah, you got enough idea. So please read the article or come and speak to me if you want to have more of a discussion on this later. Is there any questions people have got just for the last few minutes that we could possibly focus the discussion more?
It's quite a large geographical area, isn't it, between Norway and Sweden and Scandinavia? Have you pinpointed the exact location? Because it's either on Sweden or Norway, isn't it? So
yeah, you basically, good question. Basically the mountains, the Norwegian mountains, basically stretch across the whole of Norway in a northeasterly direction. You know the shape of the country is like this, isn't it? So the mountains stretch all the way across, basically. If you go around the north to get around the mountains, you're going to get into like Alaskan type of temperatures, you know, so it makes it uninhabitable. Where was the actual barrier? You know, I have not identified that. I have, you know, I wouldn't say I've looked into it in depth, but part of the thing is, you know, like I said, this is just a theory. I'm not here to convince people about this. I'm just here to put it out, what I've discovered. And actually, I don't want to spend my life trying to convince people and researching that Gog and Magog were the Vikings in case I'm wrong. I also have other things to do. So, Allahu Alim, you know, but I'm just saying, you know, these are all the things I came across that just made me feel overwhelmed in believing that they were. Sorry, yeah.
Was it the Germanic people that attacked Germany, or was it the...
It was the other people, you see, the northern people. It's very unclear because, like I said, it was prehistory. There's no written records until... written records start about 200 years after the Vikings first start invading. So a lot of it is based on conjecture as well. Yeah.
So the Gog Magog are coming at the end of time, is that correct?
Yep.
But the Vikings were over 1,000 years ago, so...
Yeah.
A lot of
Oh,
time
the
passed.
excellent question, yes. This is dealt with in the article. Unfortunately, I haven't got much time to deal with it, but I'll quickly mention, very good question. This is obviously the obvious question, yeah? Gog and Magog will come at the end of time, they will fight against Prophet Isa alayhi salam. So this is what Shaykh Imran Hussain is also, you know, his theory is that they were released at that time. But their descendants come generation after generation. It is Western European civilization. Yeah? It is the world order that we're in now, the European world order. Yeah? America is the progeny of Europe. Yeah? They're white, Caucasian Europeans, their descendants. This world order is the world order of Gog and Magog. It comes over this whole period. Now, how can this be? Yeah? First of all, Imam Anwar Shah Kashmiri also holds this position. So he says, it's like the Khawarij. Yeah? You know Khawarij, you heard of them? They're a deviant sect that come in Islam. They come generation after generation. Again and again. So similarly with Yajuj wa Majuj, that was the initial release of the people. And please do read the article, I can't explain in so many few minutes, but that was the initial release of the Gog and Magog, but it's their progeny, it's their descendants that come. After the Viking Age, 300 years, what happens? Some of the Vikings that settled in Normandy in northern France, within 2 generations they changed their name from Vikings or Northmen and start calling themselves Normans. Normans. Why did they do this? They were very embarrassed about their past. Vikings, who wants to be related to Vikings? You understand? Vikings throughout the whole of Europe had become known as barbarians, pirates, plunderers, the worst type of people. So these Normans, now when these Vikings start settling in different places, in Britain, in France, they want to shake off their lineage. So these Normans, they start taking on the titles of the French nobility. So they start styling themselves as dukes. The Viking nobility, they were known as earls. So earls they do survive. So these guys, they start calling themselves dukes and counts. So they're trying to shake off their lineage. Then they invade England. The Normans invade England. William the Conqueror invades England. So they establish themselves. The previous Anglo-Saxon people that were in southern England are pushed aside. Within a few decades, all of the landowning aristocracy, the vast majority, over 90%, has become Norman. So from Viking descent. Queen Elizabeth II is from Norman descent, from the Vikings. So what happens next? They establish themselves in Britain. They're established in Normandy. They're also established in some of the other power centers in Europe, like southern Italy. What happens next in Europe? Suddenly the Crusades start. Look at the historical map. 300 years Viking Age, literally 300 years Crusades. Europe then sinks into 300 years of sending people on missions to free Jerusalem. It becomes obsessed with Jerusalem. Yeah? What happens after the Crusades? You start coming into, like 14th century, 15th century. So we're starting off now, the beginning of the rise of Europe. The rise of Europe as a world power. The beginning, the seeds of the colonialism are sown at that time. So British ships start sailing around in all directions to look for lands to colonize. The voyages of discovery start taking place. What those British people are doing is exactly what the Vikings were doing. The Vikings were people that were sending ships in all directions, looking for lands to colonize, looking for places that they could get quick money, places they could plunder. Remember, they're pragmatists. They're not typical invaders who go around trying to set up a world civilization or an empire. They're pragmatists, they're mercenaries, they're opportunists.
By the way, what's that word you said?
Which one?
Pragmatist.
Pragmatist.
Yeah, what does it mean?
Pragmatist is someone who takes opportunities and someone who doesn't necessarily act according to ideals, but acts according to where he assesses his benefit to lie.
Practical.
Practical, yeah, practical. Well, you could, in a way, they're practical. So, there's certain people that will be fighting for an ideology, could be it whatever, a religion, a Marxism, or whatever, and they will be prepared to die for that. They don't care if they win or not. They're fighting for an idea. These people they're not fighting for any ideology. They're fighting for money and land. So, that's the timeline. And then European civilization starts. So these people from Britain are sending out ships, looking for lands to colonize, looking for places to trade. And then you come into the European colonial period. So that's when does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give them a power that no one can fight against except for Him? Is when they're given this military technology through science and technology. So now they've been given certain weapons that we just simply, people are unable to fight against. Any other questions? Got 5 minutes.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
just to your point about the Khazars, some people have said that most of the Ashkenazi or Western Jewry are descendants of the Turkic Khazars. That's why some people hold that theory.
That's right, yeah.
On that. And the Ashkenazi Jews were dominant in Zionism
Yep.
and establishing Israel as opposed to the Sephardic Jews who lived in Iran, Iraq, and the other Arab countries.
Correct. So yeah, like I said, I'm quite aware of those theories. I never found it that convincing simply because of some of the other geographical issues. The place where they came from was not a place that was like, barriered off from other people. Even if there was a wall in like Shaykh Imran says, in the Darial Gorge, there was a wall between these Caucasus Mountains. What about the other three directions? North, east and west. So there was nothing to stop them from moving. So that's why I didn't quite accept that. Secondly, some of the stuff that people mention about the Ashkenazi Jews, it is quite conjectural as well. It's not hard proven fact, historical fact, and other people have different opinions. So that was basically why I felt when I started reading about these Vikings, I felt it was much stronger. And I think Shaykh Imran, he hasn't taken it on yet, but I think it makes sense because all I've done is add one thing to really Shaykh Imran's theories, which is why I spent some time talking about some of his ideas, which is actually identifying who Yajuj wa Majuj were. The way that they come, at that time of the Prophet ﷺ, but they still come at the end of time. There's other things in my article you can read. For example, in the Quran itself, it says, وَهُمْ مِنْ كُلِّ حَدَبٍ يَنْسِلُونَ. That Gog and Magog, they will come from every hadab, every elevation. In other words, world order. They're everywhere. They will be in every part of the world. You understand? This is Quran, don't forget. This is our primary source. Hum min kulli hadabin yansilun. What does the word yansilun mean? Because I was thinking the same thing myself. How can they come like 1,000 years ago? And now. I really reflected a lot about that. And then I thought about that word, the ayah, yansilun. That word, they will come down from every elevation. What's the root meaning of yansilun? The root. Arabic always has three roots. Nasal. Nasal. People who know Urdu will know the same word is in Urdu. It's the same in Arabic. It actually means progeny. It means children. The root of it. So how does it mean come down? Yansilun is because when a mother gives birth, her baby comes down. So that's why it says in the Quran, Hum min kulli hadabin yansilun, they will come down from every high place. So they will establish this world order. But for me, that also indicated nasal, you see. There was a sign there for me that this is progeny, they're descendants. They're the descendants of Yajuj wa Majuj. And the other thing I mentioned in the article is look at Ibrahim a.s. in the Quran. Ibrahim a.s. makes a dua, Oh Allah, Ibrahim and Ismail a.s. they make dua, Oh Allah, make from our progeny a believing nation. When did that progeny come? Over 2,000 years later. The Prophet ﷺ and his ummah. So within the Quran, there's other evidence that people can be attached to ancestors or descendants of over 1,000 years. Okay, inshallah, I think we can still carry on if there's any other questions. Yeah.
Besides the Vikings, who's the
So-
other candidates
sorry.
for the Gog Magog?
For me, I don't find any other candidates. Like I said, Shaykh Hamza Yusuf, one of the teachers I studied with, he really said, I've reflected on it so much. And he was well aware of the Khazar theory as well. And he said, I don't find any, I can't give any explanation about it, So in my mind, I don't have any other
The
candidates.
Nazis, there's lots of potential people out there, aren't there, who are
Historically, for example, when the Mongols, Genghis Khan came about, the Muslims said this is Gog and Magog. So historically, when things happen, people would sometimes, point to certain people, but then after 2 generations they became Muslims, so that didn't seem to be a feasible theory. Some people say maybe the Chinese, the Great Wall of China as well. Some people say that, but
so it's speculation.
speculation. Yeah. To get Shaykh Hamza to read something like this is practically impossible. I have sent him a copy, so to get people to get the time to read it. This is why I said the people who will accept or reject will be you, brothers. students of knowledge. To get scholars to read things is very difficult because they tend to be very busy. When they find, there's thousands of Muslims now are suddenly following this idea that Gog and Magog are the Vikings, then the scholars will turn their attention to it and say, let's have a look at this. Yeah.
All right, up to whether we debate it was the Vikings or the Khazarian kingdom, but they took control of Europe, yeah, and Europe was a launching pad.
Yes.
So up to a point, isn't it like almost immaterial whether it's Shaykh Imran's argument, which is prevalent, or the one you're putting forward? We all agree that Europe has been taken over, and Europe is being used for another agenda. Or is it really important that we have to find out if it's to do with the Vikings or the...
No, I think that's a very good point. But obviously, not everyone agrees that European civilization is Gog and Magog. Don't forget, this is Shaykh Imran's theory, you see. So I think by identifying the Vikings, it strengthens that rest of the jigsaw. It's like a piece in a jigsaw, you see. Because when someone's going to read about Khazars and they're not going to be convinced, then the rest of the whole thing also becomes unconvincing, you see what I mean? About Europeans being so. From that aspect, it may be of some importance to just give that missing, the missing link to the whole picture.